So I'm going to make sure that everybody can hear me by having the microphone as close as I can. My name is Rick Hansen. I'm the state representative for this area. You are actually in the heart of my district. This is West St. Paul, South St. Paul, Mendota Heights, Mendota, and Lilydale. And we're in West St. Paul right now, and this is a Dakota County facility, Dakota Lodge at Thompson Park. So we want to thank the county for providing us with this opportunity and the warm fireplace for this evening. We have a packed agenda, as you've seen. If you don't have a copy of the agenda, we have some additional copies. And since we scheduled this, I've had a lot of questions about why are you doing this? What is your purpose here? Why are you trying to have this meeting? And our purpose is, often at the legislature, we direct agencies to do things. We hear from constituents. We ask people to do reports. And then we get the reports, and the constituents and the public may not see them or hear them. So we've asked the agencies. Last year, we at the state legislature passed a variety of things relating to pollinators. We tasked our agencies with doing some things, and we're going to hear about how they've responded to that in the last year, and some recommendations that they have. Our idea here is to get input. I would ask not to ask questions during the presentation, but the way we've structured it is, for example, we'll have DNR first. When DNR gets done, we'll have the opportunity for a couple questions. Then we'll move to agriculture, a couple questions, Bowser, a couple questions. And then we'll have a 10-minute break where you have the opportunity to meet with the speakers or look at the displays. We'll come back and we'll hear from the research component from the zoo and from the University of Minnesota. Then we'll break again and we'll hear from a panel of beekeepers, both rural beekeepers and urban beekeepers who are responding to that, and just kind of a general Q&A at that time, hoping to wrap up by 9:30 and then be out of here by 10. So the presentation is being filmed, and we do have media here as well, so just letting folks know that. I am going to introduce the speakers and then sit down because last week I tore cartilage in my knee, and so standing here is going to be a little difficult. So I will introduce the speakers, and then they'll take it from there. And I would encourage you to enjoy. If you feel a little shy about asking a question, you can write down questions. And we do have folks at the back of the room who can come around and take a question, and we can try to answer that here. Or we can respond to those later. If you put your address down or email, we can respond. So with that, I'm going to start with Bob Welsh with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources.
I'm really excited to be here. This is an interesting group. I'm used to standing in front of a group of resource professionals and sharing information. So I'm really looking forward, especially during the break, to visit with this crowd. So please, by all means, catch me during the break. Rick stole a little bit of my opening remarks here. We're here to talk about pollinators. I guess we all know that as the reasons that you're here tonight. And specifically, we're going to talk about pollinator legislation. Again, Rick mentioned that. And I'm going to talk specifically about a piece of legislation that directed us at the Department of Natural Resources to do some things. Now, I sometimes have a tendency to drone on here, so I'm going to try really hard to stay on task and be done in my 20 minutes. So, Rick, if you have to give me the hook, you just start waving at me or something. When we talk about pollinators, there's all kinds of different pollination that occurs with plants in the wild and in domesticated plants. Anything from wind pollination, self-pollination, avian pollination, mammalian pollination, but we're going to talk specifically about insect pollination. And the emphasis is clearly on bees. And especially honeybees oftentimes when we talk about pollinators, because we know a lot about honeybees. People keep honeybees, monitor honeybees, and we're surprised to hear about how many different species of bees there are in Minnesota and North America. We figure there's somewhere around 4,000 species of wild bees in North America, and probably somewhere between 350 and 400 species in Minnesota alone. Now, we don't really know how many there are, since the last species list that was generated was compiled around 1919, and there were something less than 70 species on that list. We're pretty sure there's quite a few more than that. So, as a resource professional, then I'm often asked, well, why should we be concerned about honeybees if, you know, the issue is relative to wild bees in our native plant communities? And I respond with the fact, well, the same stressors that stress honeybees also stress native pollinators. So we can all learn from each other. Bottom line is that pollinators are a strong indicator of a healthy ecosystem and a sign of the interdependence at all levels. And as managers of natural communities, we manage for diversity. And we've long recognized that diversity in our native plant communities is a strong contributor to very healthy communities that support diverse wildlife utilization, resistance to weather extremes, whether it's drought or flood or wet cycles or whatever, resulting structural diversity as well as plant diversity can support different life cycles in wildlife, whether it's nesting habitat or brooding habitat or wintering habitat. That diversity contributes greatly. And the diversity in food sources also available to wildlife. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the picture in the upper left corner. That's just a reminder to me to talk about pollinator education. The lady that you see there, her name is Kathy Bale. She is a 30-year experienced first grade teacher at Columbus Elementary up near Forest Lake. And she is extremely good at what she does, and she consults with our education coordinators at the Department of Natural Resources, and they are currently working on a pollination unit that's directed at first and second graders. So while many of us resource professionals are putting our energy into the native plant communities on the ground, my wife is actually a education specialist with the department and doing this type of work. And so Ms. Bale there is actually dressed as a bee to demonstrate the key aspects of a bee to her students. And my wife made me promise that I would talk about this, so whoever the mole is in the room, you can report to her that I mentioned it. Now, as you note there at the bottom of the slide, DNR alone manages about 5.5 million acres of native wildlands within the state of Minnesota. The state of Minnesota is about 55 million acres, so that roughly translates to about 10% of the population, or 10% of the land base. However, that 10% is not evenly distributed throughout the state. So you can see from this slide actually talks about all public ownership, and that all public ownership in the state accounts for 25% of the land base. But as you can see, as you move south and west in the state, the proportion of that land, the proportion of that land that is in public ownership and therefore native plant communities diminishes greatly. So what you will see as I talk about here is that there is a decided and deliberate emphasis on prairie as I work through some of the assignments given to us by the legislature. So what is the DNR doing currently, before we get into the legislation, to help us meet conservation goals, and especially including benefits to pollinators? Well, one is accelerating prairie protection, enhancement, and restoration. We have what we call the Minnesota Prairie Conservation Plan that is bringing together 10 different agencies and nonprofit organizations to target conservation on the prairie landscape of the state. Forest efforts relative to forest planning on the landscape and forest certification directed at sustainable forest activities. Invasive Species Operational Order 113 directs department staff in their work to be diligent and not spreading invasive species and managing against invasive species, and that goes to diversity. Numerous posters, brochures, roadside programs are things that educate the public on the value of diversity and therefore pollinators. Some of those displays are in the entryway, and you may have had a chance to visit with my compadre back there, Mike Tenney, in that display. And then finally, I'll mention Crystal Boyd. Crystal Boyd is a very talented young entomologist with our Division of Ecological Water Resources. Is going to be heading up a project that's recommended for funding through the LCCMR to take a good hard look at wild bees in the state because of those things that I mentioned earlier, that we don't know a lot about bees in Minnesota. She's going to be compiling information about wild bees, looking at museum specimens and any place we have specimens to inventory the species, look through literature review, and develop a wild bee database. She's going to look at surveying wild bees on the little bits of native prairie that remain in the state, look at the species that are there, and develop an association with the native plant community, and then finally look at both bee and plant fauna on restored prairie and see where we can learn something about our restored grasslands and perhaps improve them for pollinators. So all of that was really kind of background to get into the legislation itself, and I'm going to try to keep moving here. Primer on pollinators, and so what about the legislation? Well, the legislation, if you want to look it up, is in Chapter 84.973, and it's simply titled Pollinator Habitat Program, passed during the 2013 session. It directed us to develop best management practices and restoration guidelines. The DNR uses a formalized project management system and implemented in this case. The process was to assemble a team to work on it, assign a project manager, that was me, and develop and define the project. So really dig into the legislation and figure out what it wants us to do and interpret some of the legislation. Then move forward with the project itself, developing best management practices and guidelines, and then make them available for public review and finally implement them. This is legislation. How often, maybe this is a good question for Rick, how often can you take legislation from our legislature and put it up on a PowerPoint slide and be able to read it? This is it in its entirety, and the blue terms are the places that our project team felt a need to spend some time to improve habitat, develop best management practices for those activities to at least minimize impact to pollinators and at best enhance pollinator habitat. It goes further and asks us to develop restoration guidelines. So when we're restoring native plant communities, then we're